that you were at, but I'm involved with the cold storage and K25 ESFR system that was developed about, we announced it in August of 2004, actually had listings for it in November of 2003. I'm here for a couple of reasons. One, I was invited, so that's always a good reason to show up. One, to talk about our fire testing that we had done, the development of the system. That's a nice way to say some things that we've learned along the way. Quite frankly, it's just easier to be honest about it. We'll talk about the initial listings. We get a lot of questions from contractors, especially because we're all aware of water flow. Water flow is what costs us money in a sprinkler system, obviously. The more water we flow, the more pressure it takes, the bigger pipe we need. So our initial fire testing with ESFRs was with a K14. Why not? We all know they're inexpensive. We wouldn't flow as much water. We thought it was going to be a slam dunk. Dr. Kung at UL, formerly of FM, said this is a no-brainer. This will work. And we thought so as well. So we ran our first fire test at UL with a K14, and you'll notice in the red it says failure. Down at the bottom it says more than 9 sprinklers. A lot of people look at ESFRs being installed anywhere and solving any problem. That's kind of a misnomer. They don't solve every problem, they solve a lot of problems. And they solve a lot of problems without INRACs. But in some cases they're really not the answer. So we ran our K14 test, and we were all bumping chests before the test. We were ready, we were going to bring something really cool to market. And then after we all ran out like this, out of the fire test building, realized we needed to sit back and think about it. What we learned with the first fire test was with the propylene glycol solution, and it's a pure solution, it's not a mixture. It's not something where you have a fitter with a canoe paddle and a 55-gallon drum mix up. It's a solution. It's a chemical solution, so it's not going to separate over time. Was that even though we were delivering 120 gallons per minute of the solution, which should be a slam dunk because this was a class 2 commodity, this wasn't easy, we were only delivering half of the water. It's 50-50. We were delivering 50% propylene glycol, 50% water, and quite frankly, it just wasn't enough water to put out the fire. You need a 0.8 density, essentially, and we were only delivering a 0.6. So after looking at it, we make another head, which is a lot bigger and a lot more expensive. So the marketing people like that, where we deliver 160 gallons of water, deliver that 0.8 density at a reasonable pressure, at 40 psi. And you see here, it is a success. It was one sprinkler. It was an under 1. We'll get through some of the fire testing and kind of break that down. And then our second test, which UL runs something called an offset between 2 sprinklers, which is it's an ignition location for the fire, where we're going to ignite it. And 5 sprinklers operated. And earlier I said anything more than 6 is a fail. And the reason we say more than 9 on that first test is that's when we quit counting. So, and that's what I'm going to show you when we get there. The first fire test overview, the 1,100 gallons, which is going to be a reoccurring theme, was the volume of the UL grid. They have an inner and outer loop, but it's 1,100 gallons of volume. It's something that can be measured. We filled that with 50-50 propylene glycol. We actually pumped 1,300 gallons of propylene glycol during the test. But that 1,100 gallons, as I said, is what we consider maximum. Second line of 4x2x6 class 2, that's just describing what you've got. 4 wide, 2 deep, 6 high, 6-inch flue spaces. And when you look at the photo of the flues, you'll never see that in a warehouse. But that's the nice thing about testing. You can make 6-inch flues. It's 30 foot of storage in a 40-foot building. If you're involved in any fire testing at all, a lot of times the greater separation between the top of your storage and the sprinkler heads is a more demanding fire. And you find that with ESFRs quite a bit. It's the greater separation. When you have 15 feet, 10 feet, sometimes you'll see a failure that you didn't see at a 5-foot separation. It can be a little more challenging. 75 psi, because that was obviously the requirement for that storage height, 120 gallons. We used it 205-degree ESFR because we weren't going to build a freezer to burn down, because that's quite expensive. So what we were trying to do was essentially simulate what kind of temperature difference you had. So we used a higher degree temperature. The spacing, they were on 10 by 10, 14 inches below the ceiling. 4-inch igniters with heptane. That's just how we light up the boxes. This is a UL test. When we drop a light, it actually shows a little better.
It's over there.
It's over there.
By Paul, your door.
Oh, that's nice. Boy, it looks like Christmas now, doesn't it?
It's very romantic.
And I really wanted to show you exactly what it looks like. A fire test facility, regardless if you're at UL or FM, CNPP overseas, they're really just big boxes. There's some airflow that's being controlled, things like that, but they're not all that glamorous. It sounds better than it really is. But these are standard racks. This is a Class 2 commodity in boxes. You look down the aisleway, and this is what's called the target array. And I know a lot of you folks are probably familiar with that. But with an ESFR fire test, if you burn through a box in the target array, regardless of how well it looks, you high-fiving the whole deal. But if they walk out and they can punch if they can find the size of a quarter in one of those boxes, you just spent about 80 grand to eat lunch down the street from one of the test facilities. So that's what's important, is not only what are you doing within this rack, but what are you doing at the target. And this is the first fire test that we're going to see here in a minute. I'm not showing you the video. If we were at the bar, I'd show you the video, but this is a more staid group. So we light it up. Class 2 commodities don't burn quite as fast as a Group A plastic. Group A plastics, if you look at any manufacturer has an ESFR, we're very proud of showing our successful fire test. And normally you're testing ESFRs with a Group A plastic, and it takes about 40 seconds to get to the roof. And it really doesn't matter what ceiling you're in, because once you start burning, it just takes off like a chimney. It hits the ceiling pretty quick. Class 2 commodity, it's a little lazier fire. It doesn't draw quite as fast, quite as early, but sooner or later they all kind of look the same. This is the report you get for about 90 grand to show a failure, and this is a classic example of ring skipping. If you go online to any of the sprinkler chat rooms, read very few articles, ESFRs, there's this gigantic fear of ring skipping. And ring skipping is when you're essentially operating the ESFRs in a ring outside where they should be. And with ESFRs are a very fast sprinkler. When I was in contracting, I knew there was QR, and I knew there was standard response, and I was pretty sure that ESFR fit between the two. It doesn't fit between the two. QR is not as fast as an ESFR. They're not tested the same. The corrosion tests are different. ESFRs are very fast sprinklers. Faster than a QR, faster than a lot of the detection that we tested. We tested a lot of detection to ensure that it was faster than an ESFR. But this is an under 1 test. Number 1 went pretty quick. And if you look at the times, it was holding that fire down for about 5 minutes. After 5 minutes, it should be out. When you're holding a fire for 5 minutes, you know something bad's going to happen. And this is the classic bad. This is the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and at 9 we stop counting because we're from Michigan. And, 10 double digits are tough for us. But this was classic ring skipping, and the reason it happened was right here. See how that fire pushed out? And we're shoving a lot of solution out. I mean, we're pumping a lot of solution, 120 gallons a minute. Who would not think it just put the fire out? You know, it didn't add to the fire, but it didn't give us the wetting and cooling that we were looking for. And what happened is essentially pushed out, and now we started spreading heat across that ceiling. And it's a smooth ceiling. It's just like it's actually not a bar joist ceiling. It's a very smooth ceiling. If we look at something like this, if we were to look up at it, it spread it across. It ignited sprinklers. And that's what happens. The target array didn't fare very well either. So the second test that we ran with the K25, realizing we were not discharging enough water. Meaning the 50-50 solution, we had to discharge more of it, so we put more water initially on the fire. The first test was essentially the same first test that we ran, other than obviously we're pumping a little more water, so the pump size got a little bigger. 40-foot ceiling, 30-foot storage, under 1, which is the ignition source. 1,100 gallons is our limit. Same temperature ESFR. We use a gridded piping system, but it isn't anything that we endorse, and have actually eliminated grids from the system. Test 3, because it took 2 successful fire tests for the listing. Now you'll see that the storage height went up 5 feet. Now it was a fire between 2 sprinklers offset, which is probably one of the toughest ESFR fire tests that we can run. We describe them by their ignition point. Under 1, between 2, between 4, and offset between 2 typically gives you some fairly unpredictable results. This offset between 2 is kind of tough. But again, limited to 1,100 gallons. Same temperature ESFR, so we're trying to make up the spread between the freezer and the standard piping. When we look at the test results, test 2, one sprinkler operated at minute 10. We ran the test for 30 minutes. It was really a non-event. It looked just like every under 1 ESFR fire test should. Did not extend to the target array. That's an important issue as well. With test 3, as we look at it, we had essentially 3 sprinklers operate within seconds of each other, which is somewhat expected. Had a 4th operate about a minute after the first 3. And then after a very long time, a 5th operated, which will happen. It wasn't worth rerunning to say we had 4 instead of 5 because it was it was good for the listing. But essentially the fires really didn't look much different as far as the damage. We contained the main array and didn't extend to the target, and that's kind of what we're looking for in these type of tests. This is the second test, just to show you the way it operated. The offset between 2 is right here. These 2 operated almost simultaneously, a minute 19, minute 20. Third one shortly thereafter. Typically we'd expect this quadrant to go, the 4th, sometimes they'll extend down. The 5th was just, we're not quite sure how to explain that. We looked at the temperatures, really wasn't quite sure why that one went. It wasn't close to its operating point, but it operated. And those are the results. So that's the fire testing. The subsequent listings, because the listings that we initially received were for 40 foot, subsequent listings were due to U.S. Cold Storage. They had a facility in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania that the steel was dropped off to the site at 45 foot 3 inches. And as we all know, K25s are listed and approved at 45 foot. Knowing that, we ran fire tests at 45 foot 3, 40 foot of storage. We ran 4 full-scale fire tests for this. The first 2 were at 50 psi. The first was a success. It was an offset between 2. The second was a between 4 at 50. It failed. We ran a third at 60 between 4, which was a success. And then the third test, we lowered the ceiling height, we gave a bigger separation, which is going to be more challenging to fire. But the 60 PSI, when you look at that for a P25, that is a pile of water. It's a pile of water supply. So looking at that, there's got to be serious concerns when you're looking at that type of design. Do you have enough water to support it? We limited the system volume again to 1,100 gallons. When we look at the system design, we asked for two calculations mandated on our data pages. If you have 40-foot buildings, you're going to calculate 12 P25 ESFRs at 40 PSI. And then do a Darcy-Weisbach calculation, 6 sprinklers, 4 sprinklers on one line, 2 on a second. If you have a 45-foot, anything over 40, we show a 45-foot 3, but anything over 40, 12 sprinklers at 60 PSI, and then a 6-head calculation with the Darcy-Weisbach. There's two reasons that you run the Darcy-Weisbach. One is propylene glycol, although at room temperature is fairly liquidy, somewhat like water. As it gets colder, it gets thicker. Hayes and Williams will talk about, flow rate through pipe. By and large, we're not really talking about the water getting any thicker. Propylene glycol solution will get thicker. When it's negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit, it looks a lot like corn syrup. And that's not water, so you have to calculate at least that flow rate. The 6 sprinkler calculation in lieu of the 12 is quite frankly, after like the second head, first or second head opens, we're discharging most of that propylene glycol in a very short amount of time. So to take the system and say Cal 12 at Darcy-Weisbach is really wrong. It's not real life. So the 6 head, which is conservative enough to actually take an account for the initial thicker material flowing through it. Sooner or later, water will come out. When we look at the system volume, we limit the system to 1,100 gallons. The way we ask that you determine that 1,100 gallons is from your remote area. Take your 3 lines with your 4 heads on it. Take your remote area back to your main. Follow that main back to your riser, and that's how you pick up your 1,100 gallons. That's how you calculate that 1,100 gallons. Generally, that will limit your system area between 20 and 30,000 square feet. The reason that there's such a big span is depending on the height of the building, your requirement for your hydraulic design could be such that you're going to run a lot more 8-inch. And 8 inches is 2.5 gallons a foot, 2.66 gallons a foot. It doesn't take very long to add up to 1,100 gallons. But those are about the average system sizes. Typically, what I run into is finding systems right about the middle, at about 25,000 square feet. Now we look at the system configuration. Here we show tree-type systems. Our earlier data pages actually indicated that you could do it with a grid, which we, I guess we punish people that use grids. We didn't want anybody using a grid, but because it was really considered a wet system and it was a design availability in 13, we left it in. But we punished you for that, meaning that your 1,100 gallons was every piece of pipe. It no longer extended from your remote area back to your riser because you didn't know how it was going to be fed. So every piece of pipe had to be calculated into that. And what that would do is really reduce your area of coverage to about 11,000 square feet. It made for some fairly small systems. We've since changed the data page to read only tree-type systems. And there's a lot of reasons to run trees. These systems are going into freezers. And I can't think of a harsher environment to install a sprinkler system, a freezer. Think of all the problems you have with systems, and a lot of them are in freezers. They're double interlock free action. Maybe you run into an old dry system and you just wonder why they did it. But with this system, it's in a freezer. So we're going to treat it just like any other system in a freezer. So you're going to pitch your pipe to drain, just like any refrigerated storage sprinkler system. The tree system is going to help discharge a propylene glycol solution faster. That's an important thing. We require that every end of line be vented. So you're physically going to vent, or maybe you or I are not going to, but a fitter would be on a lift to vent all the air out of the system. Trees are a little less likely to build up pressure than a grid. And this adheres to the new requirements in the 2006 edition of NFPA 13 on pre-action systems. Now we look at the system components. It's a K25 ESFR, pen and head. We look at the propylene glycol solution. This is a little different. It is a solution. It's a certified solution. That was real important. We talked with FM and UL on it, kind of explaining what we wanted to do and wondering if we were required to have a specific listing with a propylene glycol with the sprinkler head. And really the conclusion was if you're mandating a certified solution built to these standards, you'd be okay with it. There's two types. There's one for coolers and one for freezers. The freezer propylene glycol is essentially good to -21 below zero. And these are some of the information that you need for your Darcy-Weisbach, what the viscosity is at different temperatures, and you can see that it builds up fairly readily. Between -10 and -20, it almost doubles. So it does get quite a bit thicker, and that's why the Darcy-Weisbach is required. And we talk about the system, or the system riser, and I like to say in the beginning. In the beginning, we had a wet riser, and we have, this is a CS1 pump assembly, which is really nothing more than an excess pressure pump to maintain the propylene glycol pressure on the system. Very simple system. Alarm check valve had some modified alarm trim, so there wasn't a bypass on it, so we wouldn't dilute the propylene glycol. But by and large, your basic wet system. The only difference that we had was we had an isolation valve and a riser, so when you're testing alarms, you could close that and run your water flows. We had some issues with just a standard wet system, so we had a second riser where we added a mandatory reclaim tank. And the reclaim tank is essentially there for every time you drain down your riser, you've got a place to put your propylene glycol. I'm a capitalist at heart, so if you drain all your propylene glycol out on the ground, I'll resell it to you, but you're not going to be real happy about it. So this was instituted as a requirement, and a contractor actually told us we needed to do that. He said, I bought one and I've used it a few times, why don't you put that on your data page? We said, well, we just figured most people would do that anyway. And quite frankly, nobody's going to do it unless they're made to. We also added some digital pressure switches right here and here. The first digital pressure switch was to control this pump. We had a lot of problems with contractors either getting erroneous information from the city about what their water supply was. Because generally, these systems are going to require fire pumps. So a guy would figure his fire pump. We're asking on these systems that we need a 20-pound differential between the top of the check and the bottom of the check valve. So if we say put 175 here, we only want 155 here. We had a lot of installations where at the base of the alarm check valve, people had 205 psi. I mean, just a lot of pressure. Wasn't so bad for the alarm check, that's listed for 250. But those sprinkler heads are only listed for 175, so it kind of became a problem. And what the digital pressure switches allowed us to do was, this is a relief for overpressurization of the propylene glycol. If we wanted it to open at 174, it opened at 174. Most folks use, I would say most of you use Potter switches on our risers, or notifiers. There's a fairly wide band of accuracy for those devices. They're simple, they're inexpensive, but if I want either one of those to open at 174, I've got about 10 pounds to play with. You know, it could be 169, it could be 180. These digital pressure switches are a lot nicer. 174, they're going to open it up at 173.5 or 174. We also placed one on the supply from the pump, the maintenance pump, because when we were getting this close with the pressures, we couldn't afford to have that check valve open up, so if we dropped just a very little bit, that switch would activate and start the pump. So we were keeping a few balls in the air, so to speak. Then we have the third and final wet riser. You'd almost think we were learning something as we went along. There's a second check valve in the riser that's required. The reason for that was the thermal transfer that we didn't anticipate in the freezer. It's negative 22 in the freezer. Depending on where you were at with your riser, what are most risers going to be at? Above what? 40. Above 40. So we're talking a major difference in temperature, which will tend to lead to a lot of frost on the outside of the pipe. Can lead to a lot of frost on the inside of the pipe. So we added this second check valve to bypass it. The reason we did that was to eliminate this thermal transfer from getting back to the wet riser, back to the water. We experienced on a couple different projects where this coldest temperature was going to the lowest point. That was happening on all projects, but it was cycling to the point to where we were getting sludge below the alarm bell clapper. We tried a variety of things in the lab, and this was the one that worked not only the best, but it was foolproof. Adding a second check allowed us to deadhead this thermal transfer, and adding a very small bypass allowed us to communicate the pressures between the two. To give you an idea of what we saw was at negative 20 here, we were at about 60 degrees here. So the second check with a very simple bypass worked the best. We had some pretty far out ideas, but that worked really the best for the two. I want to just back up one slide here. This arrangement is required on all existing systems. We have about 70 risers, 60 to 70 risers that the check valves are either being added as they're being installed, or they're going back and installing. So my kids don't get any Christmas presents this year, but maybe next year. What we changed the system to, and this was actually what we proposed to UL when we started out, was a pre-prime pre-action system. There are a lot of reasons for that. If you have any experience with folks that have freezers, people from Cisco, Food Lion, there's a lot of people out there that have freezers. US Cold is another one. Regardless of what happens with the sprinkler system, we all think the worst thing that can happen in a freezer is for us to flood that sprinkler pipe full of water and have it freeze. Well, that's a pretty bad thing. It's a fairly expensive thing, and most insurers won't insure against it anymore. What's even worse is to drop water on that floor. That's probably the worst thing of all. So initially, our idea was to use a pre-prime pre-action system to where a deluge valve would be holding this water back. It just took us a long time to get there. This is the system riser going forward with the deluge valve. This is a standard, it's a ported check valve. Every manufacturer makes what we call one, ours an easy riser. We still have the digital pressure switches, and then above, we still require the second check valve. When I looked at that, I thought we wouldn't need the second check valve. But this is a no-brainer. Once it's pre-action, we've got this air gap here. We're not going to have any problems. Well, we set that up at the same time as we set up our U-loop. And what we found out was, all we did was build a frost plug down the deluge valve. So the second check was required, will always be required. So you deadhead the cycling. The two digital pressure switches, one actually controls this pump, which we'll look at a little later. The The second one actually controls something that we call an automatic pressure control system, meaning if you build up pressure in the system, which is very easy to do. All you have to do is warm up the freezer. You'll build up immediate pressure because this is non-compressible. This will activate a small quarter-inch solenoid to open up and just drain that off. Because all we're trying to do is protect the ESFRs. Everything else is listed for a lot higher pressure, but the ESFRs are not. This is the wiring diagram for that. It's quite simple. It works through the digital pressure switch, goes through a normally closed water alarm pressure switch on the deluge trim, and activates this solenoid. This is I'm a sprinkler guy, so I like to see colors on wires, you know, because I can see wires and electricity. We still have a pressure relief valve on the trim, just in case everything goes wrong. You lose all the power, and that freezer starts warming up. You're talking about something that's going to build a lot of pressure, so we still do have a manual relief valve. It's set quite a bit higher than what you normally see. But again, it's there for any undue buildup in the system piping. This thermal transfer, and I'd like to get back to that, because quite frankly, it's something that's always going to be set up, regardless of how you set up the system. The closer you can put this second check valve in the freezer, actually the better you are, because it has a shorter place to actually set up that cycle. You'll also reduce the amount of frost that you have on the piping above it. The closer that check is to the freezer, like I say, and frost is going to be a fact of life. If you've ever walked through a large freezer, it's not abnormal to walk past something like this and have it be a big block of ice. I mean, it's just, they're harsh environments. The reclaim tank is really nothing more than an atmospheric storage tank. There's a variety that you can buy. I usually suggest to folks to go to Tractor Supply or Fleet and Farm, get a fertilizer tank. Doesn't have to be anything extra special. Just something to capture the volume of the propylene glycol. And it needs to be sized for your largest system. We're not asking that there be one for every system, just one large enough to capture the propylene glycol from your largest. The CS1, or essentially it's an excess pressure pump. There's two versions of it, one for 2 risers and then one from 1 through 6. The only real difference between the two is the size of the tank. With the fewer risers, we have a smaller tank, 65 gallons, 160 when we go through the 6. The way that we control the 6 is essentially through solenoid valves to the individual risers. This one opens, we lose line pressure, that starts the pump and actually starts pumping pressure into the system. So they're kind of individualized or controlled. Now to kind of show the system in its normal position, the reason we went to pre-action, or always wanted to be there to begin with, was one, that we were able to lower the pressure of the propylene glycol in the system. Once you put a high pressure propylene glycol in the freezer, it doesn't take a big temperature swing to build a lot of pressure. Because again, like I say, it's non-compressible, so it will build pressure quite easily. We'd like to see about 50 psi propylene glycol pressure in the system piping. Quite frankly, we feel that that's going to eliminate any undue pressure unless something catastrophic happens. You do lose power. You do build that kind of pressure. We do have a release system, or maybe for you folks, a detection system in the freezer, because that's what's going to activate the deluge valve, standard release control panel. When you're looking at the detection in the freezer, or the release in the freezer, depending on which terminology you're used to, if you're using fixed temperature releases or spot type heat detectors, it's almost 1-for-1 for the SFR. You cannot use protector wire in the freezer with this system, with the SFR. Protector wire is not fast enough. We ran quite a few detection fires in conjunction with the ESFRs. Protector wire operated in 5 minutes. And you saw from the earlier fire test, the ESFRs were going off in about 1:20. Quite a few detections available to you. We're essentially suggesting spot type heat detectors because they're inexpensive. You can use air sampling, that works wonderful. Some rate of rise devices work great. Rate of rise is not really the best thing to use in a freezer because if you open the door and then you close it, it warmed up and it cooled down and you'll activate the system. But there are quite a few different ones you can use. With some of the controls on the system, we look at abnormal pressure conditions. One's being too high. And what you're going to find is if they warm the freezer up, and if you talk to most people that have a freezer, they say, oh, the temperature never changes. It never changes. The only time it changes is when they're storing something different. If they don't have to keep the freezer as cold, they make more money because they don't have to spend as much money cooling the freezer. So if they warm up the freezer, propylene glycol will build up in pressure. It builds to a point that we consider dangerous, or we preset this digital pressure switch at. The digital pressure switch will activate. From there, it's going to open the quarter inch solenoid and will essentially drain back to the reclaim tank until we normalize the pressure. Once we've normalized the pressure, the digital pressure switch resets, the solenoid closes, and we're essentially done flowing water. What we do try to tell contractors is make the occupant aware that if they're draining propylene glycol back to the system, that they need to be aware of that. They have to be conscious that they warmed up that freezer. They changed what they were storing. They turned the dial up. I know it's not quite that simple, but they essentially turned the dial up, and this should be expected. You know, they should know or should feel that it should be there. Another abnormal pressure condition is the pressure is too low in the system piping. And in a normal atmosphere, the way that's going to happen is that they cool the freezer down. When they do that, this digital pressure switch will activate. From there, that will activate the panel on the CS1. That will open up that solenoid, and when it does, it'll drop the line pressure, and we'll start discharging propylene glycol, or pumping propylene glycol into the system. And at that point, once we've normalized that pressure, everything will reset, which will notice that the level in this tank will go down. And that's another thing that the occupant or end user needs to be conscious of. When he walks in and he or she sees this tank half empty, nothing's running, it could very well be that they cooled the freezer down. Now in a fire condition, the detection will operate. Because it is a standard pre-action system, the detection operates, the release control panel activates, and that's going to power a normally closed solenoid on the trim. When it does that, the normally closed solenoid will open. That will relieve the priming pressure in the priming chamber, which will open that to drain. And as soon as we do that, the deluge valve will open and water will flow through the system. Because we're non-compressible, the water will push through and it will push up into the riser for a bit of space, but then we need the ESFR to operate. And then once it does, water will flow out into the system and discharge onto the fire. One thing that you'll note is that this pump isn't operating because we've satisfied this pressure. That switch didn't drop in pressure, so obviously it has no reason to run. And with any standard pre-action system, we're going to flow water until you shut it off. So it's just going to discharge. Now, if a pipe, oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
So say the electrical portion of your actuation system, is there battery backup?
Yeah, with the release control panel, depending on, the system's not FM approved. If it were FM, it would have 90 hours of backup battery. With any release control panel, the requirement is to have a battery backup. These are, release control panels by and large are very simple controllers, if you will. They're really nothing more than light switches. The whole reason they exist is to relieve the prime pressure in that deluge valve. Regardless if you're using it for gas or for sprinklers, they're just to open up the solenoid. So the battery requirements or backup battery requirements are fairly low. So we don't really need big batteries. Like I say, FM has the largest backup battery requirement. For this panel, this is a panel that we offer. It's actually a Notifier RP1001. It's two 18-amp batteries, and that's 90 hours. I mean, that's fully loaded. That's bells and whistles and doing a lot of stuff. So there really isn't a big battery requirement for them. Now, if piping breaks in a freezer, this is really the biggest concern. We look at things a little different. When I was in contracting, I thought the worst thing that could happen is filling that piping full of water. Then it had to be my mistake. I thought it was great when it was their mistake, but I thought it was bad if it was our mistake. Because quite frankly, what happens is all the piping freezes. It fills up, it freezes, and what do? You haul it outside and thaw it out, or you refabricate a whole system and install it as you're tearing the other one out. There's a couple of ways to get there from here, but they're both pretty bad. If it happens and it's their fault, everybody gets new jackets for Christmas. I mean, it's really not that bad because it's T&M. But for the freezer people, it's a really bad thing. Because if you think about it, it's a freezer. Water fills that freezer. You break a pipe, you've got water. You're making a skating rink out of their freezer. What do they have to do to clean that up? Warm it up. Warm it up. That's exactly right. So what do they do with all that stuff in there? Have a barbecue? Do something like that? They've got to do something alternative, like hire a bunch of, or rent a bunch of trucks and keep it cold, or God help them if they have another freezer facility that's just standing at the empty waiting for this kind of catastrophe. But it's a terrible thing for those folks. And if it's my fault that I'm spraying water all over it, we're probably talking about millions of dollars. That's not a good thing. With this system, if we do break the pipe, it is a standard pre-action system, so we have a breach in the system piping, and we're draining propylene glycol. We have a supervisory switch on the system piping, which gives an alarm. It tells them something bad has happened. But it's not going to stop the propylene glycol from discharging. And when we lower the pressure in the system piping, this pump and tank starts pumping propylene glycol. So a couple of things are going to happen. You're going to have propylene glycol all over your freezer, and you're also going to empty your CS1 pump and tank. As soon as we get our low level, the pump and tank will stop operating, but you will discharge it. One of the engineers at Viking looked at this presentation and says, well, just tell them to go in and close this valve. Half the time we can't find our sprinkler valve to begin with, let alone a small trim valve to shut that off. So I don't find that as a warranted suggestion. But if you do break pipe or something happened in the freezer where we're actually discharging, we do have a mess because one, it's orange. It'll stain anything you drain it on. But we didn't let go of the line. That's the real problem. Propylene glycol you can still clean up at -10. But water you do have an issue. So that's how the system's changed. We learned a lot of things the hard way. And quite frankly, as it developed, we got a lot of suggestions from contractors on you should do this or you should mandate this, and that's why, as I've been talking, we now mandate some different things in the data pages. I made a mistake the other day. I was talking to some fitters on the phone. These digital pressure switches are really neat. They're really cool. And I said, it's really easy. It's like setting up your VCR. Yeah, and you know what? I was right. I've never set my VCR up, and we spent about an hour on the phone trying to set those up. And you know, the data page makes it sound so easy. But these are a really neat device, but there is a little bit of setup to it. So it's 24 steps to set them up.
Jeez.
Now come on.
I can do it.
24 steps, that's not even from here to there. It does go fairly quickly after the first one, but the first one is, okay, let's start over. They're digital, they give you a nice readout, and we found a lot of new uses for them, not just this. They're quite a nice control. So at this point, I think I've run out of time. So, do you have any questions? Sir?
Now, you've been concentrating a lot on flows of the solutions. Is there any criteria you have for as far as for the pipe itself and fittings?
Well, yeah, actually, your best pipe type is going to be black pipe. Don't use galvanized pipe, because what you'll do is, over time, you could set up an acidic reaction with the propylene glycol and the galvanized, depending on the quality of the galvanization. So, we essentially, support the idea of using black pipe. If you want to use, there's obviously more expensive pipes to use, but our trade doesn't mind using black pipe.
Martin, did you say that you had some issues with leakage, propylene glycol leakage heads that didn't seal?
No, actually,
You said something about replacing a whole pile of heads at one point?
Yeah, we replaced 1,300 sprinkler heads. And since we're in kind of a close, quiet group, I'll tell you why. The contractor that installed the system used a group coupling that required that it use a lubricant when it got below -10. Because EPDM, although we all look at EPDM as it's a single product, it's really not. And their group coupling required that you use this lubricant for their gasket. Well, when it started leaking, how many people know how a fitter fixes a group coupling?
Yes, with a hammer, right? Shoot
With
on a hammer. Hammer!
Well, there we go. We all know that. It's not written down. Look at any manufacturer's data on group coupling, and I don't think anywhere will it tell you to take a 5-pound maul and beat on it until the leak subsides. What had happened is there was a lot of field correction of group coupling. And PSFRs use very thin elements, operating elements, which means they're delicate. So you're a 220-pound gorilla and you're whapping the side of it, you give enough sudden impact and they'll let go. And the one project, it let go, and he realized to stop doing that after 1,100 gallons of propylene glycol.
And 1,300 heads?
Yeah, it's -20, by the way. And it was one of those things where it was just, our data page said, follow the group coupling manufacturer's recommendation. Now, I was a designer a long time. I can't say that I ever read the group coupling manufacturer's data on their rubber. I mean, I can't remember ever doing that, so I can't fault anybody for that. So we sent out a whole bunch of new group rubbers and lubricant, and obviously K25 heads, because we didn't know how much damage had actually been done. So it's just easier to replace them. So if you don't come away from anything on this, but I do tell you to quit smacking couplings with a hammer, then I think we've done good. But that's why we changed it. The propylene glycol, by and large, is propylene glycol that you use in any other sprinkler system. It leaks a little more in water. It has a lower surface tension. It's more slippery. It likes to leak out of stuff where water won't. If you make up a good threaded joint or a good coupling, one thing that I will get a little nerdy on you, with the EPDM, you have a glass transition temperature, and it's -60. The colder it gets, the more it becomes glass-like. Or excuse me, it's -40. It's not -60. It's -40 Fahrenheit. So at -20, it's pretty close. It's pretty brittle. So if the manufacturer asks you to use something to keep it pliable, you would want to do that, regardless if it's this system or any other freezer. And it really would explain a lot of the leaks that we have in double interlock reaction. I mean, you look at a lot of the problems that we have in double interlock reaction, it's all air supply. It's almost always air supply. So that would be one thing I would offer to you. Yeah.
I have a question for you. If I'm understanding that right, if there's a break in the pipe or a head pops for some reason, you've got that glycol mixture flowing out of that location, and there's nothing like automatic wise to shut that solution line off, like a automatic valve that's sensing too much flow in a condition like that. There's nothing built into the system to shut. There's not.
No, remember, it's a standard sprinkler system
Sure.
with propylene glycol in it. It'd be no different than a wet system. If a wet system were to operate, there is a specialized system that will shut down due to water flow with no activation. But with this system, if you broke a pipe, it'd be no different than any other pre-action system. With a pre-action system, you'd let all the air out, and you'd get a low pressure alarm. With this system, you would discharge all the propylene glycol and still get a low pressure alarm.
Would you not want that to happen? You know, I mean,
Oh, gosh, you would never want to drain all that.
Yeah.
With 1,100 gallons, I would, it'd be a lot of money that you'd be dropping on the ground
So
if you didn't hit it.
in a condition like that, would you want to have an automatic shut off so that accidentally wouldn't happen?
Well, you're looking at a couple of different controls. If you were to have, where would you indicate your breach in the pipe?
Well, what you do is put a flow switch in on the riser and have that, when actuation the flow switch, would shut that off, but if the detection system went off, it would override the flow switch and allow the glycol to be introduced and
Now-
have a real fire condition.
We have a system that does that. We use a flow control valve to do that. The one thing that you may want to think about is the propylene glycol in the piping is where all the volume is at, not in that small pumping tank. The largest volume you have in that small pumping tank is 3 barrels. You're probably going to have 25 or 30 barrels of propylene glycol solution within the piping. If you break a sprinkler head or you break a piece of pipe, all the money hitting the ground is due to the piping or the volume in the system piping. Without being able to know where it's going to break, you couldn't stop it from happening. The 3 barrels that are in there, if it happens, and I'll make this tonight and I'll even sign a paper. If you broke a piece of pipe on this system and drained out everything, and that pump and tank emptied, I'd send you the 3 barrels for that. Of course, you'd be sending me a check for a lot more. So I'm not that giving. But there really isn't that much in that pump and tank. It's really there just for pressure. Because it's non-compressible, we don't anticipate that pump and tank to operate much. When it does, it won't operate long. So because the pressure will be built in.
At one time, it was my understanding that the 1,100 gallons was just in the path from the header to the sprinkler heads. The system itself could contain a lot more than 1,100 gallons.
That's correct.
Right, because we're talking 1,100, everybody thinks 1,100, but it could be 2,000 or 3,000 gallons.
Yeah, I would say on average that it's anywhere from 2,400. The largest I've seen is about 3,200 gallons.
So you could have 3,200 gallons of propylene glycol on the floor, not 1,100. That's only between the valve and the sprinkler heads. So you got to keep that separated as 2 different things. I know that that's important, but
Oh yeah. Well, hopefully you break something at the high point, and then everything's just waiting. It won't go anywhere.
just another question I had about the filling of the overflow tank. Do they basically recycle that and put it back in the other one?
With the reclaim tank, there's actually there's a bypass on the CS1. So if you wanted to pipe it directly in, you could. The problem with, or I wouldn't say the problem, probably the drawback to that is that CS1 pump and tank is meant for high pressure, not high volume. Most guys are, if they are piping it direct, they'll pipe it direct, but they also have an alternate source where they can make a second pump and pump into the system.
But there's obviously this raising of the temperature and lowering of the temperature. That's a regular operating procedure of that cell. So you can expect it on a very regular basis. So do you actually find these people having to replenish that tank, or are they basically recycling it on a constant basis when they if they're aware of it. And how often would it happen? It's like twice a year, or?
Well, no. Depending on who you're dealing with. If you're dealing with what I consider an end user, like Kraft or Kroger or somebody like that, they have fairly constant temperatures. When you're dealing with somebody like U.S. Cold,
Yep.
and there's a ton of these folks out there. I didn't know quite how many freezer folks there were until we started dealing with them. U.S. Cold, they have something called a convertible freezer, and they convert it to the temperature for whatever they're storing because it's a rental space. It's no different than for them. They're building condominiums. That's all they're building. People bring their stuff in. Today it could be cookies, it could be bread, it could be whatever it is. But if they can change that temperature, obviously warm it up, cost them less money. They will, because they're in a competitive business as well. So that temperature is not just something that may happen once a year.
Not U.S. cold storage. And those guys were very hard to deal with, particularly that Italian.
They were not.
I was telling you to make sure that they have the Panzer truck with you and all that stuff. Boy, that guy sounded rough. I was involved with the project early on at Bethlehem for United Cold Storage, and the contractor, the general contractor was a guy from Chicago who sounded like he was
From
a friend of
Chicago.
the mafia. My God. And you had to deal with him, obviously. Is he the guy that talked you into 1,300 free heads and that kind of stuff?
No, we actually talked to John Stubit from U.S. Cold Storage.
The nice guy.
Well, they're serious about their fire protection, and you'll find with most end users they are. They got a lot of loose that they burn out of building, and we just told them, let's just change all the heads. Everybody sleeps well at night. It's no big deal. We're chipping brass every day. Well, some of you guys make up for it. Right, Alan?
Was there any thought or testing done with Class 3 goods, for instance?
The problem we had with the Class 3 commodities, is we talked with both FM and UL about it. We spent a lot of money at both places, so we can call them up and ask. There hasn't ever been any full-scale testing with Class 3 commodities. All of the full-scale testing are with Class 2s and Group A plastic. With a Class 3 commodity, and we'll probably start running some Class 3 commodity fire tests, I would say by spring, but it's going to be at the exact good that it's going to be stored. Because Class 3 commodities, quite frankly, probably aren't all that well founded. You don't really know what you're burning. We can talk about the heat release rate and how we measure what a Class 3 commodity is, but I would rather go into a fire test facility with a bunch of frozen seafood and burn that, rather than a bunch of cardboard full of plastic that, I don't know if it's weighted more towards Class 4 or Group A, or is it too light? You know what? We consider seafood, wrapped seafood Class 3, and there's no problem in burning. And that's what we're doing.
Isn't that the same with Class 4 that really has never been a test? It was an extrapolation of something that 3M did a long time ago, you were saying?
Probably 3M's fault. As far as the commodity classification, they're typically, you can take anything to a cone calorimeter and measure it, and it says that it's in this group. But without full-scale testing, and quite frankly, FM was the first one to say, don't do it. Run the Class 2, be happy with what you're getting. If you really think that you need to run the Class 3, then get the stuff and burn it. And that was FM's advice to us. And again, it's not an FM approved system. It is not an FM approved system, but obviously we want to talk to folks that have experience or maybe have an opinion.
Are there any further questions?
Has it been submitted to FM for approval?
Well, we talked to FM early on, back when Joe Hankins was there. I don't know if you folks remember Joe Hankins. Well, remember, it isn't like he's dead. Good old Joe, we talked with Joe a little bit about it, and at that point in time, the fire test facility wasn't ready. It was really a bad timing thing from a fire standpoint, and they had an experience with a similar freezer system that
Passing lightning?
I think that's what they called it. that they really, they had other issues they were working with. So, but they were more than helpful with some of the ideas that we had.
One more question, Ken?
Can the Darcy-Weisbach calculation be run on programs up to date, or is that a hand calculation?
Well, both, yes. If you have a later version of Haas, it's buried in it. Crane's got a program for Darcy-Weisbach. A lot of contractors use that. You can do a hand calc with Darcy, but because most folks don't do it all the time, most folks just make a lot of serious mistakes with it. It's not as repetitive as Hayes and Williams. I look at a lot of calcs, and a lot of times I got to look at them 4 or 5 times to go, I think it's right. If you do anything with phone systems, a lot of times you'll have to run a Darcy-Weisbach. And a lot of guys are glad they don't do a lot of phone because they don't have to do it very often. So, but yeah, you can do it by hand. And if you call and ask me if it's right, I'll just sounds good.
I think we've kind of run out of time here. You've done an hour. Wow. Almost right on the nose.
Well, I tried.
I guess I speak for myself. I think also for a lot of people, this has been extremely informative. I don't think that a lot of us knew exactly about all the double check valves and everything else, and that whole idea of the freezer plug, that was quite an eye-opener. Must have been pretty shocking to you too, I guess, when you saw it all frozen.
I think shocking's a good word.
Yeah, shocking on the pocketbook too.
We used other words, but...
Okay. I'd like to thank Martin very much for coming out tonight and telling us all about the freezers. We're not going to have a meeting in December. We'll have another one towards the end of January. We'll notify you guys when that happens. In the meantime, Martin, thank you very much.